In the last lecture, I explained how to create a user interface using the bada UI, in particular, lists and pop-ups. In this lecture, I will construct a more sophisticated UI using other UI components. First, I'll explain the common properties of the UI guide and controls, and introduce various other controls. From these, I will show you an application using containers and multiple forms. Then, as before, I'll explain how to create a UI using the Interface Designer. The bada framework suggests 6 basic principles to develop more easy-to-use user interfaces. First, use most of the screen for the content. Second, design the interface concentrating on important tasks. Third, keep the content on the screen simple. Fourth, minimize unnecessary user interactions. Fifth, provide faster ways to use the application or features. And finally, number 6, design the user interface keeping less is more in mind. Next, let's have a look at the common features of the bada UI control. First, you can add listeners to the bada UI controls to handle touch, drag and drop, focus, and key events. The geometric functions provided by the controls include functions to set and get the bounds, position, and size, and the contained function is provided to identify if a point is within the control or not. A custom drawing function and a request redraw function to redraw a control are also provided. Additionally, functions to set and get the current state of the control, such as the visibility and the enabled state, are also provided. Functions to manage the name, the hierarchy of the controls, and the life cycle of the control are provided for each control. Let's take a look at an example of a few controls. The first controls to be covered are Edit Field and Edit Area. Edit Field is a control that receives one-line text input. Edit Area is a control that receives multiple line text input. Both the Edit Field and Edit Area controls deliver events through the iTextEventListener object. So if the contents of the entered text are changed, the onTextValueChanged function of the event listener is called. If the user presses the Cancel button while entering text, the onTextValueChangeCanceled function is called. Right, let's briefly look at how to use the Edit Field control in some code. The Edit Field is constructed passing the rectangle with the position and the size. The event listener, used to get information when the text is changed, is added. Then, a name is given to the Edit Field to distinguish between edit fields when there is more than one edit field. Finally, the Edit Field is added to the form. Then, you have to declare the object as the listener, iTextEventListener, and implement the listener function to handle events. This is an example of the form class that includes the edit field and performs the role of the listener. Since the form implements the iTextEventListener, the onTextValueChanged and onTextValueChangeCanceled functions are declared. In the iInitializing function of the form, the edit field is created using the new operator, and then constructed by specifying its position and size. The event listener is added to the edit field and it is given a name. Then, the edit field is added to the form. In the onTextValueChanged function of the event listener, the name of the input source control is checked, and if the name is the same, the text is retrieved from the source and is printed on the log. As before, the onTextValueChangeCanceled function has been implemented as a dummy function. Next is an example of a button control. A button is one of the most intuitive and effective ways for direct interaction through a UI. In bada, a button has text, bitmap, background bitmap, and text color properties. You can set the bitmap, background bitmap, and text color depending on the state of the button, such as normal, disabled, or pressed. iAction Event Listener is used as the event listener of the button. Events are delivered through the onActionPerformed function of the iAction Event Listener. Let's have a look at how we can create a bitmap button. You can create a bitmap button by calling the new and construct functions. You can specify the position and size of the button by specifying the rectangle parameter of the construct function, which contains the position and size parameters. Since this example is for a bitmap button, an empty string is put for the text parameter. Then, a bitmap is added to the button. I'll go over the procedures to create a bitmap in detail later. Then, the action ID is specified for the button, and the listener is added. You then add the button to the form so that it can be displayed on the screen. We're ready to take a look at a list in more detail, in particular, a custom list. A custom list item is an item of the custom list and contains multiple elements. This custom list item contains the custom list item format class. The custom list item format is the class that defines the layout of the elements of the custom list item. In this example, each of the elements are custom list element objects. Each element put in an item can handle its own events through the iCustom Item Event Listener class. Let's have a look at an example of creating a custom list item. To create a custom list item, you have to create the custom list item format, which is the layout of the elements put in an item. Using the custom list item format, you can specify the element ID, the bounds that defines the position and size of each element, the text size, text color, and text color when the element is focused for each element. To create a custom list item, you have to define the height and the format of each cell. Then, you add each element to the created item. You can specify an element by setting the bitmap and text of each element ID in the format. To perform a custom drawing for a specific element, you can add the subclass of the iCustom List Element class as an element. Let's have a look at how we can create a custom item. To create a custom item, you have to create a custom list item format. Create and construct the custom list item format and add the elements to be put in the format by calling the addElement function. An ID should be assigned to each element, and the rectangles specifying the position and size of the elements should be specified. If necessary, you can additionally set the font color or font size. This example shows the procedures to create a custom list item. You can also create a custom list item and construct it using the cell size. Then, you can create the custom list item by setting the format and adding text or a bitmap to the corresponding element IDs. To perform a custom drawing for an element, create the iCustom List Element subclass and override the drawElement function within the subclass. After the class is defined, you can create an instance of the class and set the instance to the custom list item as an element. To get the specific element related to each event, you have to call the setElementEventEnabled function to change the state of the element so that it can receive the event. The custom list item provides two interaction methods. The first is interaction with the entire custom item. The second is interaction with a specific element in the custom item. The iCustom Item Event Listener class is the event listener that is added to a custom list. This class provides two functions to process interactions. The first function can handle interactions corresponding to the entire item, and receives the list item through the source underscore control, item underscore index, item underscore ID, and the status parameters. The second function is used to deliver the interaction applied to a specific element, and additionally receives the element underscore ID parameter. Now let's take a look at the sample code. The form class is declared as the iCustom item event listener, and the two functions of the same name, onItemStateChanged, have been declared. While one receives an element ID, the other handles the interaction for the entire item. So let's take a look at the procedures to create a custom element. The myElement class is a subclass of the iCustom listElement class, which enables the custom drawing. In this class, you can implement a custom drawing by overriding the drawElement function. This example shows the procedures to get a canvas. I'll cover the procedures to draw an object on a control using a canvas in detail later on. In the onInitializing function of the form, the custom list is created first. This custom list is also constructed by specifying the position and size of the list to be displayed on the form. For the style parameter, normal is specified. Then, the event listener is added to the custom list. Next, let's have a look at how to create a custom list item format in order to create a custom list item. First, the format is created and constructed. Then, 3 elements are added. Each element has an ID and a bounds rectangle. For the elements that display text, the text size, the foreground color, and the background color are specified. To enable the direct interaction with element ID 0, the setElementEventEnabled function is called. Now let's take a look at the procedures to create the list item using the format. There are 10 items in the list. Each custom list is created using the new operator and is constructed specifying the height as 100 for each interaction of the loop. Then, the constructed format is set and each element is added. The created item is then added to the list. As before, the created list control is added to the form to finish the initialization process. Next, I'll show you the 2 event listener functions. The first listener function is called when an interaction is applied to the element corresponding to the custom drawing. The function prints out a message stating that an interaction has been applied to the element. The second function is to handle item interactions. The function prints out a message stating that an interaction has been applied to the item.